Attention! You are about to learn a story that remained hidden for decades, an account based on rare documents, forgotten testimonies, and archives that almost disappeared. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And if you appreciate historical stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Now turn up the volume, turn off notifications, and come with me on this investigation. The box arrived on a Tuesday morning in April 2003. It was small, weathered, and wrapped in fading brown paper. Dr. Marcus Johnson had almost discarded it as junk mail until he noticed the military markings and his grandfather's name scrawled across the top. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed newspaper, he found a leather-bound journal. The first page bore a simple inscription: "Property of Private First Class Raymond Johnson, Montford Point Marines, 1943. Marcus had known his grandfather served in the Second World War, but the old man had rarely spoken about it. He passed away in 1998, taking his stories with him, or so the family had thought. The journal's pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, detailing daily life in a segregated military. Private Johnson had documented everything: the training at Montford Point in North Carolina, the journey across the Pacific, and most significantly, a battle that official history had all but erased. The first entries described the formation of what would become known as the Montford Point Marines, the first African Americans allowed to serve in the United States Marine Corps. Before 1942, the Marine Corps had been exclusively white. Executive Order 8802, signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, changed that, though not without resistance. "They gave us different uniforms," Private Johnson wrote, "faded greens that didn't quite fit. The white boys got the new ones. Our barracks were half-built, with no hot water, but we stood straighter than anyone else. We had more to prove. Training was rigorous, designed to break the will of men already fighting prejudice. Staff Sergeant James Wilson, known as Hawk to his men, pushed them harder than the white instructors. The world is waiting for us to fail," he would tell them during pre-dawn marches through North Carolina swamps. "We will not give them that satisfaction." By mid-1943, the newly formed Black Marine units were deployed to the Pacific. But not for combat. They were assigned to ammunition depots, supply stations, and labor battalions. Their task was to support the war effort from behind the lines, loading shells, unloading supplies, building airfields. "We came to fight," Private Johnson wrote. "Instead, they gave us shovels." Staff Sergeant Wilson's unit, the 834th Depot Company, was stationed on a small island in the Pacific. Their days consisted of loading and unloading ships, 12 hours in the scorching sun. The Marines they served alongside rarely acknowledged their presence except to give orders. Lieutenant Thomas Baker, a young officer from Boston, was assigned to oversee their operations. Unlike many white officers, Baker spoke directly to Staff Sergeant Wilson, seeking his input on improving efficiency. A cautious respect developed between the two men. "Lieutenant Baker treats us like Marines," Johnson wrote, "not like servants. Some of the men don't trust him. They've been fooled by false respect before. But Hawk says to wait and watch. A man reveals his true character in crisis, not comfort." That crisis came sooner than anyone anticipated. On the morning of July 10, 1944, Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the island's northern supply depot. The established front lines were miles away. No one expected combat here. The few infantry units present were quickly overwhelmed, creating a dangerous gap in the American defenses. The official report, filed 3 days later by Colonel Marcus Whitley, described what happened next. Regular combat units regrouped and repelled enemy forces with minimal casualties. The report made no mention of the 834th. Private Johnson's journal tells a different story. The attack began at dawn. The sound of distant explosions woke the men of the 834th. Staff Sergeant Wilson was already dressed, moving between bunks, ordering his Marines to take defensive positions. "This isn't a drill," he said. "We're Marines today." Lieutenant Baker arrived minutes later, his uniform disheveled, a radio in hand. The news was grim. Japanese forces had broken through the northern perimeter. Combat units were scattered or pinned down. The supply depot, containing ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies for the entire campaign, was directly in the enemy's path. "If they reach those supplies, we lose this island," Baker said, "and possibly the next 3. He looked at Staff Sergeant Wilson. "I need your men." Wilson didn't hesitate. "My men are ready, sir, but we'll need weapons." The armory officer initially refused to issue combat weapons to the depot company. "These men aren't trained for combat," he argued. Lieutenant Baker removed his sidearm and placed it on the desk. "Either open that armory," he said quietly, "or explain to headquarters why you let this island fall." The weapons were distributed, mostly older model rifles and a few machine guns. Staff Sergeant Wilson organized his 144 men into 4 platoons. Many had never fired their weapons outside of basic training. "Remember your training," Wilson told them. "Keep your heads down. Aim carefully. We're Marines first and everything else second." Lieutenant Baker approached with a map. Together they devised a strategy. Rather than confront the Japanese force directly, they would set up positions along the ridge overlooking the main road to the depot. If they could slow the advance, perhaps the regular combat units would have time to regroup. "It's likely a suicide mission," Baker admitted quietly to Wilson. "Then we'll make it count," Wilson replied. They moved out before sunrise, navigating the dense jungle to reach the ridge. Private Johnson, assigned to Wilson's command group, carried extra ammunition and the platoon's only radio. As the sun rose, they saw the Japanese force moving along the road below, approximately 200 soldiers with light artillery support. "We were terrified," Johnson wrote. "But when I looked at Staff Sergeant Wilson, his face showed nothing but calm determination. If he was afraid, he buried it deeper than any of us could see." At 0700 hours, Wilson gave the order to open fire. "You're following this so far? If this story is touching you, help us bring it to more people. A like makes a difference. A comment motivates us. A share multiplies our reach. And if you're not yet subscribed, join our community." Now we return to the moment when everything truly began to change. The first volley caught the Japanese force by surprise. They had not expected resistance at this position. Several fell immediately, while others scattered for cover. The Black Marines maintained disciplined fire, just as they'd been trained. The Japanese commander quickly reorganized his forces, directing covering fire while maneuvering a flanking unit through the dense undergrowth. Staff Sergeant Wilson anticipated this move. He had positioned Private Henry Davis and a small team with one of their precious machine guns to protect their eastern flank. When the Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle, Davis's team was waiting. The ensuing firefight was brief but decisive. The flanking maneuver failed. For 3 hours, the 834th held the ridge against increasingly desperate attacks. Their ammunition dwindled, casualties mounted. Private Marcus Williams, a former schoolteacher from Philadelphia, was hit while reloading his rifle. Corporal Samuel Lewis, who had been a boxer before the war, died carrying wounded men to the makeshift aid station behind the ridge. "We fought not just for ourselves or even for victory," Johnson wrote. "We fought to prove what should never have needed proving, that we were Americans, we were Marines, and we would not fail." Lieutenant Baker moved constantly along the line, directing fire, encouraging the men, radioing updates to headquarters. When a Japanese mortar round landed nearby, sending shrapnel into his left arm, he merely wrapped a bandage around it and continued. By mid-morning, the situation had become critical. The Japanese had brought up additional forces. The 834th was down to their last boxes of ammunition. Several men were loading their final clips. Staff Sergeant Wilson gathered his remaining squad leaders. "We can't hold much longer," he said, "but we've bought enough time. The combat units should be regrouping behind us. We need to fall back in order." As they prepared to withdraw, the radio crackled to life. Lieutenant Baker listened, his expression changing from tension to disbelief. "New orders," he announced. "We're not falling back. Combat units are still disorganized. We're to hold this position at all costs." He hesitated. "No reinforcements are coming." Private Johnson described the moment in his journal. A silence fell over the men. Not fear exactly, something deeper. The recognition of what was being asked of us. What had always been asked of us, to give everything while receiving nothing. Staff Sergeant Wilson looked at the tired, wounded men around him. Then he checked his own rifle, confirmed it was loaded, and stood. "If we retreat, the depot falls. If the depot falls, the island falls. If the island falls, more Americans die." His voice carried along the line. "We are Marines. This is our post. We will hold." What happened next would later be described by a war correspondent who arrived the following day as a masterclass in defensive tactics with minimal resources. Unable to maintain their extended line with dwindling numbers, Wilson consolidated his forces at 3 critical choke points along the ridge. He ordered the remaining ammunition redistributed, giving priority to their best marksmen. Rather than simply awaiting the next assault, Wilson organized a series of small, coordinated counterattacks. 5 or 6 men would advance unexpectedly, fire several well-placed shots, then quickly withdraw before the Japanese could respond effectively. These unpredictable movements created the impression of a larger force and kept the enemy off balance. Lieutenant Baker, despite his wound, led one such group. When his rifle jammed during an advance, he picked up a weapon from a fallen Japanese soldier and continued fighting. Private Johnson accompanied him, documenting even in the midst of battle. His journal entries from these hours are brief, written in a shaky hand, but capture the intensity of the moment. "Men I've eaten with, trained with, are dying around me," he wrote. "Yet somehow we hold. The Japanese push forward, we push back. They have not passed." By early afternoon, the situation had grown desperate. The 834th was down to less than half its original strength. Many were wounded, but refused to leave their positions. Ammunition was so scarce that Wilson ordered his men to use captured Japanese weapons. Then, at approximately 1400 hours, the tide began to turn. The Japanese attacks, growing increasingly costly, became less frequent. Unbeknownst to Wilson and his men, their stubborn defense had accomplished more than just protecting the depot. They had created a bottleneck that allowed other scattered American units time to regroup. The first indication of this came when artillery shells began landing on Japanese positions, American artillery firing from the south. Then the distinctive sound of American aircraft overhead. "Hold fast!" Lieutenant Baker told Wilson after another radio transmission. "The 1st Battalion is counterattacking from the south. We just need to hold a little longer." The 834th did more than hold. When they observed the Japanese forces beginning to reposition to face this new threat, Staff Sergeant Wilson made a bold decision. "They're dividing their attention," he told Lieutenant Baker. "This is our chance to hit them where they're weakest." With the last of their strength and ammunition, the remaining Marines of the 834th launched a coordinated attack down the eastern slope of the ridge, striking the Japanese force from an unexpected direction at the very moment they were turning to face the approaching American battalion. The effect was decisive. Caught between two forces and believing themselves surrounded by a much larger American presence, the Japanese commander ordered a retreat. By 1600 hours, the battle was over. The depot was secure. Of the 144 men of the 834th who had taken position on the ridge that morning, only 73 remained unwounded. 37 had been killed. When the commander of the 1st Battalion, Major William Harrison, Arrived at the ridge position, he found Lieutenant Baker and Staff Sergeant Wilson sitting side by side, exhausted, organizing what remained of their men. "Who are you people?" Major Harrison asked, surveying the Black Marines with evident surprise. 834th Depot Company, sir," Staff Sergeant Wilson answered, struggling to his feet to salute. "United States Marine Corps." The aftermath of the battle brought momentary recognition. Major Harrison personally commended Lieutenant Baker and Staff Sergeant Wilson for their extraordinary leadership under fire. Medical teams treated the wounded without the usual segregation. For a brief time, the men of the 834th were acknowledged as combat Marines. Then came the official reports. Colonel Marcus Whitley arrived the following day to assess the situation. After a brief tour of the battlefield and discussions with Major Harrison and other white officers, he began preparing his account of the engagement. Lieutenant Baker, still bandaged but insistent, approached Colonel Whitley with Staff Sergeant Wilson to ensure the role of the 834th was properly documented. Private Johnson's journal recounts their conversation. Colonel Whitley listened politely, making occasional notes. When Lieutenant Baker finished speaking, the colonel closed his notebook and smiled thinly. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, Lieutenant, but let's keep our reports focused on the essential facts. The successful defense was ultimately executed by the 1st Battalion. Your colored stevedores provided auxiliary support, which is commendable, but hardly the focus of this engagement." When Baker protested, citing the casualties and the critical role played by Wilson's men, Colonel Whitley's response was curt. "The public isn't ready for certain narratives, Lieutenant. The official report will reflect what's best for morale and the war effort." The official account, published 2 weeks later, mentioned only that support personnel assisted in delaying enemy advancement until combat units could be deployed. No mention was made of the 834th Staff Sergeant Wilson or the Black Marines who died defending the ridge. Lieutenant Baker filed a separate report detailing the actions of the 834th and recommended Staff Sergeant Wilson for the Silver Star. Both documents were classified and filed away. Neither would be seen again for nearly 6 decades. The men of the 834th were quickly reassigned to different depot companies across the Pacific. Staff Sergeant Wilson was transferred to a supply base hundreds of miles from the front lines. Lieutenant Baker, after recovering from his wound, was assigned to a staff position away from combat operations. Private Johnson continued his journal, documenting this swift return to invisibility. "Yesterday we were Marines. Today we are laborers again. The blood on the ridge has already dried. Our dead are buried in graves that say nothing of how they died. We are being erased even as we continue to serve." The war moved on. Islands were captured, battles fought, victories claimed. The contribution of the 834th faded from official memory, preserved only in Private Johnson's journal and in the minds of those who had been there. After the war, the veterans of the 834th returned to an America still deeply segregated. Many never spoke of their combat experience, finding that few believed their stories when they contradicted the official narrative. Staff Sergeant Wilson returned to his hometown in Georgia, where he opened a small hardware store. Despite his service, he was not allowed to join the local Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter. He married, raised 3 children, and never again mentioned the battle for the ridge. Lieutenant Baker became a lawyer in Massachusetts, occasionally attempting to gain recognition for the men he had served with. His letters to the Marine Corps and the War Department went unanswered or received polite, dismissive responses. Eventually, he too fell silent. Private Johnson returned to Louisiana, where he carefully preserved his journal but shared its contents with no one, not even his family. "Some truths," he wrote in his final entry, "must wait for the world to be ready to hear them." That readiness would be decades in coming. In 1972, Dr. Malcolm Carter, a historian researching minority contributions to World War II, began interviewing aging veterans of the Montford Point Marines. Most of his subjects spoke of their service in supply units, construction battalions, and ammunition depots, the roles officially assigned to Black Marines during the war. Then he met Harold Jenkins, formerly a corporal in the 834th. Jenkins, suffering from terminal cancer and perhaps feeling freed by his prognosis, broke decades of silence. "We weren't just loading ships," he told Dr. Carter. "We fought, we died, we saved an entire depot from being overrun, and maybe the whole damned island. Then they buried the truth deeper than they buried our boys." Carter was skeptical but intrigued. Jenkins provided names: Staff Sergeant Wilson, Lieutenant Baker, Private Johnson. Carter tracked down Wilson, by then retired, who reluctantly confirmed Jenkins' account but refused to be formally interviewed. "That history is written," he said. "Rewriting it now won't bring back the dead." Lieutenant Baker, however, was more forthcoming. Now a judge nearing retirement, he provided Carter with detailed recollections of the battle and his subsequent attempts to secure recognition for the 834th. "I failed them twice," Baker told Carter. "First, by not preventing them from being erased from history. Second, by eventually giving up the fight to correct that erasure." Carter's research hit a wall when he attempted to access official records. The reports were classified, ostensibly for national security reasons. His requests for declassification were denied. Without documentary evidence beyond the testimonies of aging veterans, his work remained unpublished, existing only as notes in an archive at Howard University. The breakthrough came in 2001, nearly 60 years after the battle. The Military Records Declassification Act opened thousands of previously restricted World War II documents to historical research. Among them was Lieutenant Baker's suppressed report and his recommendation for Staff Sergeant Wilson to receive the Silver Star. Dr. Lisa Montgomery, researching African-American military contributions, discovered the documents and recognized their significance. Her publication of The Ridge Black Marines in Combat During World War II in 2002 sparked renewed interest in the story of the 834th. But something was still missing. Lieutenant Baker's report, while detailed, was written from his perspective as the commanding officer. The voices of the Black Marines themselves remained largely absent from the historical record. That changed when Raymond Johnson's grandson opened a small box that had made its way to him through a series of improbable coincidences. The journal provided a first-hand account that brought the experiences of the 834th vividly to life. Dr. Marcus Johnson, himself a historian, worked with Dr. Montgomery to validate the journal's contents against the newly declassified military records and the testimonies of surviving veterans. The results were undeniable. The story that emerged was one of extraordinary courage, sacrifice, and subsequent erasure from history. By this time, few veterans of the 834th remained alive. Staff Sergeant Wilson had passed away in 1988, never knowing that the truth would eventually come to light. Lieutenant Baker, in his 90s but still sharp-minded, wept when he was shown Private Johnson's journal. "They were the finest Marines I ever served with," he said in his final interview. "I have spent 60 years being honored for my service, while they were denied even the acknowledgement of what they did. That was the real wound I carried home from the war." In 2012, the Marine Corps officially recognized the combat role of the 834th Depot Company during what became known as the Battle of Supply Ridge. A belated Silver Star was posthumously awarded to Staff Sergeant James Wilson. The surviving veterans and families of the deceased were invited to a ceremony at Marine Corps Base Quantico. Raymond Johnson's journal was donated to the National Museum of the Marine Corps, where it is now prominently displayed alongside other artifacts from the Montford Point Marines. Visitors can read his words, preserved under glass. "We fought not just for a cause or a country, but for the right to be remembered as men who fought." The story of the 834th represents more than just a correction to military history. It illuminates the complex ways in which history is created, curated, and sometimes deliberately shaped to reflect the prejudices and priorities of its time. Colonel Whitley's decision to minimize the role of black Marines reflected the social and political realities of 1944 America. It was easier to maintain the narrative that black servicemen were support personnel, not combat troops, regardless of their actual actions. This erasure had consequences beyond the historical record. Veterans of the 834th were denied the recognition, benefits, and opportunities that often came with distinguished combat service. Their silence upon returning home was not merely personal preference, but a response to a society unwilling to acknowledge their contributions. As one of the last survivors, Corporal William Morris, now in his 90s, explained, "We came home to a country that wouldn't let us ride at the front of a bus. Who would believe we had held a ridge against an enemy battalion? So we kept it inside, carried it with us. Some memories are too heavy to share when no one wants to help you carry them." The recovery of this history also reveals the power of persistence and documentation. Without Private Johnson's meticulous journal, Lieutenant Baker's suppressed report, and the testimonies of those who broke decades of silence, the true story of the 834th might have remained buried forever. Today, a small monument stands on the Pacific island where the battle took place. Its inscription reads, "In honor of the men of the 834th Depot Company, United States Marine Corps, who fought and died here in defense of their country and their comrades. Their courage saved many." Their story reminds us that history is written not only by those who hold the pen, but by those who persevere until truth prevails. Raymond Johnson's final journal entry, written on the day of his discharge in 1945, seems prescient in retrospect. They think they can make us disappear from this story, but we were there. We bled there. Someday, someone will find these words and know the truth. History is patient. It can wait for those ready to hear it. History did wait. And now we have heard. End of the narrative. This story, like so many others, was almost forgotten. Your support ensures that we continue to rescue these accounts. If you liked it, leave your like. Comment on what you thought. Share with those who also appreciate real history and explore our channel. There are more cases waiting for you. I'll see you in the next episode.